Good afternoon, everyone. Kind request to everyone, kindly switch off your mic, please. Huh? So I am Dr. Javed, Assistant Professor from Department of Cardiothoracic and Vascular Surgery, Manakla Aeromedical College. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming you all for this webinar on recent updates on COVID-19 pandemic, being organized by the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery, Cardiology, and Pulmonary Medicine. As you all know, COVID-19 is a deadly pandemic caused by the novel severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. This infection may be asymptomatic or it may cause a wide spectrum of symptoms such as mild respiratory tract infection to life-threatening sepsis. COVID-19 pandemic started as a pneumonia of unknown etiology in the Wuhan province of China in December 2019. And currently, this pandemic has affected more than 200 countries all over the world with more than 15 million cases as well as 6 lakhs deaths all over the world, including 30,000 deaths from our country. So since the pandemic keeps on striking in India, as doctors, we should keep ourselves updated, not only to treat our patients in a better way, but also to protect ourselves from this deadly virus. With this brief introduction, I welcome today's speakers. First of all, I welcome Dr. Ashida, a consultant cardiologist from our college. Madam is currently the head of the Department of Cardiology and a highly competent interventional cardiologist of our hospital. She is an astute physician, an academician, and a source of inspiration to juniors. Madam will be rendering her knowledge on the cardiologist perspectives during COVID-19 pandemic. I welcome you, ma'am, for this webinar. Next, I welcome our head of the department, Dr. Arun Kumar Arasappa. Sir has the credit of initiating the Department of CTVS in our college in March 2016 and is successfully running the department for the past 5 years, performing all types of cardiac and thoracic surgeries, including minimally invasive cardiac surgery. Sir is a good teacher, a good surgeon. I welcome you, sir, for today's webinar. Next, I welcome Dr. Yuvraj, head of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine. Dr. Yuvraj needs no introduction. Sir is an eloquent speaker and is an invited faculty for various national and international conferences. Sir has more than 30 national and international publications to his credit. He'll be enlightening us on the recent updates and pulmonologist perspectives of managing COVID-19. I welcome you, sir. Last but not least, I also render a warm welcome to all the senior faculties, junior faculties, as well as the postgraduate students who have gathered here for the webinar. With this, I conclude my speech and I invite Dr. Yuvraj, head of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine, to share his knowledge with us. Over to you, sir.
COVID-19 pandemic. Just back to save yes. Good afternoon, one and all. Thanks, Dr. Javed, for a nice introduction. So, without wasting much of time, as he introduced all the aspects of how the COVID-19 has originated from China, we will see in this presentation that how it has originated and how it is damaging the human race very badly. So what is this COVID-19? COVID-19 is nothing but coronavirus disease 2019. Is an unfolding viral pandemic exacting a significant toll on the human race. Already, as it was told by Dr. Javed, that it started in December 2019, last year, in Wuhan city, okay, from the live seafood market, as a cluster of cases of pneumonia with unidentified etiology. It was soon identified to be caused by a separate novel strain of coronavirus, now named as severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, that is SARS-CoV-2, by International Taxonomy of Virus and also by WHO. So this coronavirus is not a new virus. This virus is known for more than 100 years. This is a large group of viruses that cause common illness, usually a mild illness, sometimes serious illness, in human beings and also in animals. Rarely in animal coronavirus can evolve and infect the people and then spread between the people, such as already we saw two major epidemics, that is SARS in 2002 and MERS, that is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome in 2012. And now we are just encountering this SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which is one of the worst pandemic in the coronavirus family. So WHO, under international health regulations, has declared this outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern on 30th January 2020, exactly some 6 to 7 months before. After that, WHO specifically declared this one as a COVID-19 pandemic, as it affected and it hit almost all the major countries in the world on 11th March 2020. So what is SARS-CoV-2? The common coronavirus, as I already told you, the coronavirus can cause illness both in animals and human beings. The common coronavirus genus and species that cause illness usually in clinical practice are 220NE, OC43, NL63, and HKU1, which is not at all of significant interest now in this presentation. Just for completion, I'm telling. But these three things are very important. These three coronavirus, what I'm just going to tell right now, which caused a major harm to the human beings. The first one is the SARS epidemic, that was in 2002. And then is a MERS, that is a Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, that is in 2012. And now we are encountering SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And this is the third coronavirus that caused severe disease in humans to spread globally in the past 2 decades. So let's have a look at the story of this worst pandemic. You see here, initially this coronavirus, that SARS-CoV-2, was thought to be originated from bats. Bats are considered to be a reservoir for this coronavirus. So basically, this virus circulated among the bats, infects among the bats and circulated. By somehow, it has a cross-species transmission. Either it has transmitted to other animals that was sold in the live wet markets in China, or in cross transmission, there are different animal species are there in the form of pig, wild bird, chicken, cat, and dog are there. So we don't know how it has got this cross species transmission. Still, it is not clearly understood. But as a form of zoonotic transmission, man got infected with this SARS-CoV-2, where bats are considered as a reservoir, and pangolins. We will tell in Tamil as Erumbuthini. These pangolins are considered as an intermediate host, that are widely accepted intermediate host for this SARS-CoV-2. When man got infected, he transmits this virus in the community, particularly those who are in close contact, either by droplet spread or either with direct contact, or either with fomate transmission, usually with the close contact, that is mass gatherings and all. Now it has spread to all over the world. And out of those who are infected, only 20% got severe illness, and they will be admitted in hospital. Out of 20%, 5% will get a more severe disease in the form of ERDS and sepsis. They will go to the ICU. The worst part is that last thing I mentioned, the healthcare workers, because the coronavirus, that is SARS-CoV-2, is spreading rampantly. The worst it will be the healthcare workers, either in the form of doctors, nurses, and all, who are working in the hospitals day to day, day and night to save these patients. Because of this, we are not very clear about the mode of transmission, even though droplet spread is considered as one of the wide mode of transmission for the SARS-CoV-2. But it's not very clear, even after putting precautions. There are some cases which are being transmitted from infected patients to normal patients. So this places that doctors and nurses and healthcare workers at higher risk, those who are taking care of this the SARS-CoV-2, that is COVID-19 pneumonia patients. So let's have a look what is this virus and how the structure looks. You see that SARS-CoV-2, why it is named as coronavirus? Corona as a term, it is a Latin word. It is otherwise called a sun, like a sun. You see it's a spherical shaped virus having a surface spikes, like a sun spikes. These spikes are very, very important because these spikes helps the virus to get attached to the receptors. These are called spike proteins or spike receptors. The protein that is associated with the spike protein, and it is considered as one of the most immunogenic antigen that is there in the SARS-CoV-2. Other than that, you can see the membrane protein. That is, this membrane protein is responsible for the organization of the viral structures when it enters into host cells, and envelopes small proteins and hemagglutinin esterase. These are the various components that are there in the SARS-CoV-2. The most important will be the spikes. That's why it is termed as corona. Corona is nothing but a spiking spherical structure that is there. So that we have to consider it. And after this virus, how it enters in the human body. You see, when the coronavirus actually expelled in the form of droplet infection from the infected host, you can see this coronavirus actually have the surface spikes I told. So when it comes to the host cell, we have a host cell. There are receptors called ACE2 receptors. These ACE2 receptors are highly concentrated in the respiratory tract, and it is also told that these ACE2 receptors are also there in myocardium. That's why these two organs are worstly hit by this virus, very badly hit by this virus. And these ACE2 receptors are concentrated more on the upper respiratory tract, predominantly in the nasopharyngeal area. That's why that is the logic in doing this test, that swab test we are taking from nasopharyngeal, because these cells, the nasal epithelial cells, have the higher trophism for this SARS-CoV-2 virus. After this virus gets attached to the ACE2 receptor, this virus gets entry into the host cells. There is once again a transmembrane protein is there that I have not mentioned because there's too much for us to know the pathogens at this level. There is one more protein called transmembrane protein. This helps this virus to get inside into the host cells. As you know, this virus actually uses our host for its for building its territory, for building its empire. So you can see this, once a virus enters into the cell, it hits the host cell ribosomes, it undergoes proteolysis. I think we all know all these things. There is a genomic RNA replication. It takes a Xerox of all the replicas of virus will be produced, and all the multiple proteins and other proteins which is responsible for the antigenic property of virus will be produced, and then which will get assembled to a new SARS-CoV-2, and then by exocytosis it is released. You could see that one virus gets into the lot of virion particles, and that has the potential to spread to multiple hosts. So you could see this virus has different pathways. One, it can act directly in the lectin pathway. It can activate the complement pathway. It can activate the inflammatory pathways, particularly toll-like receptor pathways are activated. Because of this activation, you can get a lot of chemokines, that is interleukin 1, 6, and 8. All these things, actually, it is produced from the host cells to protect us, but actually it is produced in enormous number so that it can damage our host system, including all the tissues. The main target will be the alveolar membranes, alveolar epithelial cells, vascular endothelial cells, a special mention, because most of the viruses or most of the bacteria mainly targets the alveolar epithelial cells, whereas this virus actually, in addition to the alveolar epithelial cells, it causes leakage, it causes major damage to the vascular endothelial cells. In addition to that, also cause the risk of thrombosis, microthrombosis everywhere in the body, which is responsible for the pathogenesis of the SARS-CoV-2. So the other inflammatory cells, neutrophils and macrophages, which is considered as acute inflammatory markers. So these also will be elevated and raised. This will release all the mediators which cause potential damage to the organs, vital organs, particularly lungs, heart, and kidneys. So this is the timeline. You see that day 0, the virus is entering into the human body. From day 1 to 2, the viral replication starts in the airway cells. So after its entry into the upper respiratory tract. So you could see these are the areas where the different drugs are. I will come to that later. After in 1 to 2 days, viral replication occurs. In 3 to 5 days, you will see the activation of our innate immunity in the lungs. That's why not all the individuals are going for a severe illness. Okay, there is some innate immunity is there that can protect our protect the host from this from the devastating viral illness. And you can see there are different pathways are activated, all these things. So by 5 to 7 days, host response is very good. Then by 5 to 7 days, the symptoms and all these things, actually he could control the virus, he could contain the virus inside the body. But in the bad scenario, average roughly around 11.5 to 12 days, the patient worsens. All these inflammatory markers take into the action, and then it causes potential damage to the lungs, heart, and sometimes kidney also. So after it enters, then what does it act like? I already told you, it causes potential damage to alveolar epithelial cells. These alveolar epithelial cells, actually, if it is like, non-stick tawa, okay, it won't allow any water inside. Okay, if you put a drop of water also, it will stay to one side because it won't allow any water particle inside the alveoli. It is free. Actually, it is coated like thing. So this alveolar epithelial cells is responsible for that. And these alveolar epithelial cells, both type 1 and type 2, is badly damaged by this virus, and because of that, this alveolar membrane gets thickened, and that affects the diffusion. Your alveoli gets filled with the fluid. This is common pathology for all the ARDS. In addition to that, you will get the microthrombi, one of the more specific finding in most of the patients where medical autopsy was done for all the patients with COVID-19. You say microthrombi, and the cardiac thing, I think Madam will discuss that in detail in the next presentation. And also acute renal injury also will happen, and liver will be involved in the patients with the multi-organ dysfunction syndrome once the patient goes for sepsis and systemic inflammatory response syndrome. You could see that most of the patients, 80% of the patients will be asymptomatic. That's what I told. Within a matter of 7 days, even if you do nothing is going to happen to the patients. And some patients will have a mild illness, and very few patients will have a serious illness, and very, very few patients will have a life-threatening illness. But we need to monitor that patient very carefully. The main problem with this COVID-19 is that a sudden devastating complication, sudden worsening of illness. We can't, rely on the, clinical course of the illness, because some patients worsen very rapidly. This will be very common in older age groups and those patients with added risk factors. Okay, let's see what are these various modes of transmission. The major mode of transmission, already I told you, it's basically by respiratory droplets. This you should see the droplet. First, let me clarify what is droplet and what is aerosol. So droplet are just slightly larger particles that are that is released from the patient, from the host, from the infected host. This will be very common when the patient have illness and the patient coughs out, because vigorous coughing will release lots of droplets. Since droplets are larger and it is it won't travel to the longer distance, it gets settled into all the surfaces over nearby surfaces. That's the logic behind the you should not touch the objects, because fomite spread is also considered one of the mode of transmission for the SARS-CoV-2. And second thing is that the aerosol is nothing but the fine drop that these droplets are very, very small in size. These are respirable droplets, less than 5 microns. It can be suspended in air for long duration of time. It won't settle out easily in any other surface nearby the patients, and then it can carry out to a longer distance unexpectedly, depending upon the wind and depending upon different factors that is prevailing in the environment. And most important thing is that you can ask one thing, sir, which is the what is the major mode, how a droplet is produced from the infected patient. The main thing is the patient should have a coughing and sneezing. That is one of the common mode that will release thousands of droplets. Whereas, just by talking, singing, and sneezing, the droplet amount that is released will be very less. But you can't rely on this, because why I'm telling, it depends once again on vocalization, how we are speaking. There are some people they use the voice very slowly. There are some people they use voice, so that naturally some people will produce droplets. So even though they are not symptomatic, so these patients have high risk of transmitting their SARS-CoV-2 from their body. And this query, does it spread by aerosol? Because this is one of the panic thing. Aerosols, the thing is that it it abolishes our faith in social distancing. Because when it spreads by aerosol, you don't have distancing and all, because it can spread anywhere. Okay, WHO declared this airborne transmission droplet nuclei in aerosol generating procedure. Very important. So WHO accepted that airborne transmission definitely is there. Particularly those people who are involved in aerosol generation, particularly those people, anesthetists who are intubating the patient, critical people who are intubating the patient, they are exposed directly to the respiratory tract, they will generate a lot of aerosols, one thing. And second thing, we used to do a bronchoscopy and all these things, procedures. So that will generate a lot of aerosols. And main thing, in this COVID season, those patients with airway disease, particularly they use nebulizers and all. This nebulizers and all these things and all, that generate a lot of aerosols. And when the patient is in ICU, when we use HFNO and NIV, if the mask is not properly fitting, when the air is going inside, and the expiratory air, if it's not filtered, and then this air gets released, and that is also the aerosol spread. But we don't know that how this aerosol is contributing for this COVID-19 pandemic. We don't know how much cases it has contributed, because this is based on the various studies like isolation of RNA particles, viral particles from the sampled air. Just by mere presence of isolation of RNA particles from the sampled air doesn't mean that these viral particles are infective. So we can't come to a conclusion. All these are experimental studies. I think in future we will get a clear idea about this. That's the same thing. Aerosol, less than 5 microns diameter, greater than 6 feet distance. Droplet, more than 5 microns diameter, that is less than 6 feet distance. So that is the thing. And what will be the clinical course in COVID-19? The median incubation period for most of the patients after the viral entry into the host is around 5.1 days. And most of the times within 5 to 10 days, they will have an acute mild illness. I'll tell you what are the symptoms that the patient will have. And after 10 days, from days to weeks, if the disease worsens, it can attack the lungs and it can lead to ARDS and poor inflammatory pace. And at one point of time, there are only two possibilities: either the patient worsens or succumbs, or the patient will have a recovery. And recovery is not a thing that these patients will have somewhat lifelong crippled disease, because most of the times it is a reversible disease. Sometimes they have a residual lung disease and they have a residual impairment in the forced vital capacity that will affect the patients for long duration. So when do you suspect this COVID-19? So any patient with acute respiratory illness, any patient with fever with at least one sign or symptom of respiratory disease, either cough or shortness of breath, even though it is non-specific, because we get cough and shortness of breath in a lot of diseases. And we could also add a history of travel to or a residence in a location where there is a community transmission, where there are a lot of clusters of cases of COVID-19 reported during the 14 days period to the symptom onset. Or any patient with any acute respiratory illness or having a contact with a confirmed or probable COVID-19 case in the last 2 weeks period to symptom onset, or any patient with severe acute illness with cough and shortness of breath requiring hospitalization, and in the absence of alternative diagnosis. So in this season, any patient with cough and shortness of breath, until proven otherwise, you just think COVID-19 is the first point, rule out that, and then you work out for other conditions. So what is a confirmed case? As simple as that. That's a laboratory confirmation. We use RT-PCR. We use nucleic acid amplification test as one of the gold standard. Even though it is not considered as a high gold standard, it is one of the gold standard what we are using day-to-day practice, irrespective of clinical signs and symptoms, as clinical signs and symptoms are non-specific in COVID-19, in SARS-CoV-2. So what are the symptoms the patient will develop? The patient will have a cough, usually a dry cough will be there, hawking, irritating cough night time. Fever, not typically a very high grade fever, not more than 102 or something like that. It will be somewhere around 100 to 101. And sometimes also with chills and rigors. Muscle pain, myalgia, very important. Most of the patients, pre-symptomatic patients, they will present the myalgia. Shortness of breath and difficulty breathing will be in only in some group of patients where lung involvement is there. Sore throat, very rare symptom, sore throat, because sore throat is very common upper respiratory symptoms. You may get a lot of viral illness and other GERD, other conditions also. Sore throat, among all the symptoms, considered less common in COVID-19 when compared to other diseases. Very important is that loss of taste and smell. Anosmia and ageusia, that is a loss of different taste and loss of taste is there. So these symptoms are reported by certain patients and they are considered somewhat specific to COVID-19 because these symptoms are reported even before the origin of respiratory tract symptoms. So as per the data from IDSP, these are the common symptoms with percentage. Fever 27%, cough 21%, sore throat 10%, breathlessness 8%, weakness 7%, running nose for 3% and others 24%. So whether it is COVID or common cold, many people have a doubt because most of the patients we see have allergic rhinitis. They have a post-nasal drip cough. How to differentiate that? And they have a doubt that whether they have a common flu, which is very common. This flu is very common almost in all the seasons. So there is a doubt. So you see that almost like, fever will be there in most allergy, you don't get fever. Whereas in cold and flu, you will get fever. And here you see that sore throat is not very common in COVID-19, whereas sore throat is common in other upper respiratory illness. That is flu-like illness. It's very common. And running nose, sneezing is very common in allergy and flu, whereas running nose, sneezing is less commonly reported. And shortness of breath, very, very important. You don't get any shortness of breath in allergy, cough, a cold or flu. You get shortness of breath in allergy, provided the patient is a known asthmatic. If the patient is asthmatic, definitely shortness of breath will be there. Symptoms gets worse progressively is very common with COVID-19, whereas in flu, in a matter of less than a week, you will have an improvement of the symptoms. So who are at risk? These are the patients who are at risk, age more than 60 years of age. Those patients are having a chronic diseases, either in terms of cardiac or respiratory, diabetes, hypertension, cardiac disease, chronic lung disease, CVA, chronic kidney disease, and those patients are long-term immunosuppressants, and those patients have underlying malignancies. So how do you classify the disease? Now that we have seen the patient, how do you classify? We can classify as pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic. I'm including that because some patients are asymptomatic. It's better to use pre-symptomatic than asymptomatic because many patients don't even notice that they have a weakness, they have a myalgia. So that's why I used to tell us it's a pre-symptomatic. So mild illness is a fever with upper respiratory symptoms, mild sore throat, GA symptoms. Testing is considered in select individual high risk group because Now the problem is that RT-PCR is somewhat costly. The testing potential of the government is also we have to consider. We can't do testing for almost all the people in the population if it has got a community transmission. That we have to categorize that. And moderate patients, that any patient who having respiratory involvement, having respiratory rate of more than 24, saturation less than 95, with a heart rate of 110 beats per minute, blood pressure of less than 90. We need to have a high priority for testing because we need to confirm to give a special treatment strategies. And severe cases like SpO2 less than 19 room air, hypotension with inotropic support, either involvement in the form of ARDS or in the form of viral myocarditis. Okay, how to diagnose? Now the patient is having is a suspect case. How to diagnose? The sample that what I already told you, this virus has higher trophism for upper respiratory tract epithelial cells. So we target on nasopharyngeal area. The nasopharyngeal swabs is usually taken. If nasopharyngeal swab is not possible, nowadays they are in US and all, they are using nasal swabs because the patient can only take the nasal swab. They can put the swab, but they can swipe out the nasal cavity and they can take that. Throat swab is considered inferior to all these two swabs because throat swab actually the sensitivity is somewhat very low when compared to swabs. That's why we are using hybrid swabs. They take us one swab from the nasopharyngeal area, another swab from the throat, and then saliva and bronchoreal lavage. Bronchoreal lavage, that is from bronchoscopy. I already told you this is an aerosol generating procedure. It is a risk for healthcare workers and other people also who are working close. This should be restricted to only those patients who are intubated or only those patients who are seriously ill. Then we could not. So, what are the methods that we can use to diagnose? Virus is there. How to diagnose any organism? How to diagnose? One is serological test, blood test based on the immune response. So that is an antibody test and antigen test based on the organism. Another one is gene test, which is another amplification, gene amplification. That is a RNA based test. That is gene amplification test. What we commonly use reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction (RT-PCR). Other forms are cartridge based nucleic acid amplification test. This is also a nucleic acid amplification, and TrueNAT, which is a basically Indian made nucleic acid amplification test. What is the difference between these two? RT-PCR is a conventional. You can proceed with a large number of samples. Okay, so you can get the results at least within 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours. Because of the load, the government is giving the report on the next day, 1 or 2 days. Here, antibody test may be simple, but it is not highly reliable because not all the people have a good immunogenic response. They have a different immunogenic response. Some people develop a very slow immunogenic response. So with that, we can't come to a conclusion whether the patient is having true infection or acute infection. So that, and antigen detection test, until we detect the proper antibodies, it's very difficult to tell what antigen can be used for detection test. So what is the role of serological test, whether you use or not? So at present, serological test should be used only for epidemiological purpose, and it should not be used for other illness. However, the presence of antibodies may not confer immunity because not all the antibodies are neutralizing. How frequently second infections with the SARS-CoV-2 occurs remains unknown because we don't know that reinfection when it occurs and all. And we also don't know how long this antibody is going to present. This is a small diagram regarding when the antibodies are. This is the incubation period. Just before 14 days before exposure, the day 0, that's the incubation period, no symptoms are there. 0 to 7 days symptoms are there. At that time, when you do the antibody, acute phase reactant will be there. Within a matter of 7 days, you get a IgM slowly rise. And in 14 days, you get a IgM. Same times, IgG also will rise. Both will rise after 14 days. And IgM will come down after 1 month. Whereas IgG is one of the antibody which gives long-term protection. This will go up to long duration. And we don't know that. That's why I put here, because when there is a waning of this antibody level, there is a chance of reinfection is there. But we need to evaluate this further. What are the other investigations we can do? Other axillary investigations, you can do CBC, because one of the poor prognostic markers is lymphopenia, because this virus mostly attacks this lymphocytes. It increases the death of these lymphocytes, they decrease the production, so that's why it's there. Renal involvement can be assessed by creatinine level, liver involvement by AST, ALT, multisystem involvement is there, and X-rays and other things can be assessed. Very important thing, these are CRP, LDH, and ferritin. This assess the inflammatory response from the host cells. If that is there, steroids are much helpful in this case. So these are the other radiology that we can use. Chest X-ray, non-specific peripheral opicities. CT, you can see all the findings. Ground glass, bilateral involvement, posterior distribution is there. So these are the scoring system we use to assess whether the patient is having COVID-19 or not, which is very important from the radiologist perspective. You could see these are the ground glass opacities, which are peripheral, and these are not specific for COVID, but these are specific for COVID. You could see that there's a ground glass pale opacity, and you could see the dilated vessel only in that area. The pulmonary vasculature, this is called vascular sign, somewhat specific. These are the fibrotic strands that occurs after this resolution of this COVID-19 patch in the periphery of the lung. So let's come to the final part, that's the treatment. most of the people will require home-based care only. That's a supportive care. Over 75% of patients require oxygen. So hospital patients require oxygen. Those who are unresponsive to oxygen, there are only two options. You put the patient in ICU, either you put it on NIV, non-invasive ventilation, or HFNO, high fluid nasal cannula. But these two things, I already told you, the risk of aerosol transmission is there. We don't know the exact results. So it is an interim for intubation. And because ARDS in SARS-CoV-2 revolves rapidly, several patients may fail this maneuver. Ultimately, we have to do an intubation, but intubation is one of the worst things that you can do because most of the patients is succumbing after intubation. And early consideration of prone ventilation is important in these patients. So you could see this is very important because any patient, those with hypoxemia without respiratory fatigue, we can avoid intubation because timing of intubation is controversial. I'm going to that, whether we can do early or late. You see that there are awake prone maneuvers. This can improve the ventilation in the posterior part of lung, which is not used. You can see it's a self maneuver. The patient is not maintaining saturation, requiring more than 4 liters of oxygen. Ask the patient, you teach the patient, ask the patient to lie down, ask the patient to lie on the right lateral, and ask the patient to lie on left lateral position, ask the patient the prone supine position. That has to be repeated every 30 minutes to 2 hours. So with this, they can improve oxygenation to some extent, and it is very successful in most of these patients. And these are the antiviral drugs that are studied. I'm just recapturing that. Chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine has got a good results initially when they are used in China, but afterwards, when the disease hits in Western countries, Europe and US and all, there is not much of supportive evidence is there, mainly by Solidarity trial, which is on the wide explained WHO, and recovery trial. They told that there is no use at all for this drug. But actually, in India, as per the Indian guidelines, still we are using this hydroxychloroquine at a dose of 400 milligram on day 1 twice daily and 200 milligram from day 2 to day 5 or day 10. And this drug has to be given under supervision and it has to be monitored. And I think Madam will cover that. And this drug actually, is not shown to reduce the mortality or reduce the duration of illness. Lopinavir already tried, not useful. Oseltamivir, still the people are using. I could see some people in Pondicherry also using. There is no logic in using oseltamivir because oseltamivir is a neurotransmitter inhibitor. There is not such type of receptor. A neurotransmitter enzyme is there in the structure. There is no point in giving oseltamivir in this group of patients. Remdesivir, strong in vitro activity. Initial studies shows that no reduction in mortality, but in compassionate basis, in emergency use authorization, EUA, this was recognized now, and we can use only for severe cases. Favipiravir, it was launched in a grand way, but like studies are telling that it's an equivocal response. We can use, but we can't guarantee that it will give a good response. Immunosuppressive, already told you there are two immunosuppressive, steroids and tocilizumab. This could be used only when there is a higher inflammatory markers after doing all the tests. There are two steroids, methylprednisolone and dexamethasone. We prefer to use dexamethasone because recovery UK trial, they have studied a lot. 6 mg should be given for all the patients OD. All the patients, those patients mechanical ventilator, those patients require long-term oxygen or long-duration symptoms. Can we give prophylactic low mercury? Yes, we can give prophylactic low mercury at OD dose. And whether therapy dose has to be given, it's still a query. Convalescent plasma. We can take the plasma from the treated patients or the patient who are affected, and we can use that. That also should be restricted as a rescue therapy for hypoxemic patients. How do you prevent? How healthcare workers can prevent themselves? Because I'm not going into detail regarding the normal mask because healthcare workers should not use normal masks according to me because these are the things will give high protection to that to healthcare workers. That's why I gave importance to that. Respirators are nothing but the device which protects the people, those who are wearing that, which protects them from the toxic gases, fumes, atmospheric dust, particles, and microorganisms also. There are two types. One is it purifies the atmospheric air. Another one is it supplies the fresh air. Okay, these two things should be used only in the occupational emergencies, only gas accidents and all. These things are commonly used. Out of that, negative pressure, positive pressure. Negative pressure, commonly what we are using is N95. N95 with filters, without filters. I think exhalation valves, I think with exhalation valves you should not use. These two are very important. These are replaceable filters, half phase and full phase. It provides higher level of protection compared to that. It provides higher protection compared to this N95. And this positive pressure. Positive pressure, air purifying respirator is that you can have a positive pressure and it will purify the air very rapidly. And finally, only 2 slides. How do you manage as per the Indian guidelines, what we are doing? In mild case, when the patient comes to you, he can be managed in COVID care center. So contact and all precautions you have to take, stick and hygiene has to take. And symptomatic management with adequate hydration. Fever is there, paracetamol, all the adjuvant therapy, vitamin C, zinc, whatever, you can give that, supportive therapy. And hydroxychloroquine has to be given only for the patients who are having high risk. age more than 60, diabetes patients, CVA patients, hypertensive patients, you can use it. Cardiac patients, without the knowledge of cardiologists, without professional people are there, without seeing the QT interval, it is detrimental to start that, and you should not do that, even though there is no proof is that for that. When the patient is having pneumonia or signs of severe disease, respiratory rate more than 24 or SpO2 more than 94, we can admit the patient for oxygen support. I already told you, there are two options. Awake proning should be there. Anticoagulation can be done. OD dose can be given. Corticosteroids, IV methylprednisolone 0.5 to 1 mg per kg, dexamethasone 0.1. Duration is very important. Only 3 days we can do, 3 to 5 days. Antivirals we can try, but not even a single antiviral give a good response. And other investigation therapy that I'll come to you. Severe disease, not responding to all these things, ultimately you have to intubate the patient. Lung protective ventilation is there. I think sir will tell regarding that. And same anticoagulation we can use. And steroids, very important. This has high role. Only thing, dose is very high. There I have used 0.5 to 1 mg. Here I have used 1 to 2 mg per kg. Dexamethasone 0.1 to 0.2 mg moderate case. Here I used 0.2 to 0.4 mg. Duration I used only 3 to 5 days. Here I used 7 to 10 days. But one thing is that when you are giving high dose steroid, there is always high risk of secondary bacterial infection or secondary fungal infection in this group of patients that you have to consider. These are investigational therapy. You can use remdesivir, sanfilazine, tocilizumab. Ventilator strategies, ARDS strategy. Don't push too much of air. Low tidal volume, keep the PEEP, optimal PEEP, keep the plateau pressure very low. That's one other thing that you do. Prone ventilation, very successful. Both awake and after intubation also, if possible, give prone ventilation for most of the patients. And vaccine, one of the hot topic for our public. Vaccine, whether it is available or it's not available right now. 120 vaccines are under trial. It is under phase 1 to phase 3 trial. There are different targets that we can use: nucleic acid, inactivated live virus, viral vectors, and all. SARS-CoV-2 S protein, already told. This is one of the potent immunogen. That is the one is going to help for the vaccine protection. However, we don't know about the duration of immunity. When you give vaccine, how long will be the protection? When you give vaccine, how long this protection will be there, and whether booster doses are needed or not, we don't know. At present, 2 to 3 doses is sufficient. DCGI approved 2 vaccines. One from Bharat, that is this Covaxin. Already it started 3 days before from AIIMS. It started. Volunteers are included in that. And with this, I'll end my presentation. Why I put this is that both in because this is too much for COVID-19. We are still in the mystery, and I think we will get a good idea in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yuvraj, for your enlightening speech on the pulmonologist perspectives of COVID-19. Now I welcome Dr. Ashida, consultant cardiologist of our hospital, to enlighten us on the cardiologist perspectives of COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now I'll deal with the COVID-19 and the cardiovascular system. So what is the cardiac relevance of COVID-19 infection? So though the lung is considered as a primary target of COVID-19, increasing reports have shown that cardiovascular system is also involved in COVID-19 infection, and this brings the heart into focus. And as the case reports have started increasing, it was found that there is a close association between COVID-19 infection and cardiovascular comorbidities. So it was found that patients who have COVID-19 patients who have associated cardiovascular comorbidities had increased mortality, and also the severity of COVID-19 infection correlated with the cardiac manifestations. So it is imperative that we have to know what is the interaction between the SARS-CoV-2 infection and the cardiovascular system. So in addition to the pulmonary symptoms, cardiac injury is a prominent feature, occurs in about 1/3 of the hospitalized patients, and also contribute to about 30 to 40% of deaths. So now I will like to go through in the following agenda, like what is the pathophysiology, how that affects the heart, what are the cardiovascular manifestations, and what is the interaction of COVID-19 and the cardiovascular disease, and what are the challenges in the acute coronary syndrome management, and what are the Indian guidelines for it. Now, coming to the pathophysiology of cardiac injury, it is not fully elucidated. It is definitely multifactorial. As Sir mentioned, the COVID, the virus, it uses the ACE2 for as a ligand for entering into the intracellular entry and by endocytosis. So, since almost about 7.5% of myocardial cells have positive ACE2 expression, the virus may be using this receptor and may cause direct cardiotoxicity. Very few reports have shown the the viral markers in the cardiomyocytes, and it has been in autopsy studies, but it's not well established. The second mechanism by which it causes cardiac injury is by hyperinflammation with cytokine release. This in turn causes vascular inflammation, it causes plaque instability, it causes hypercoagulability, and subsequent myocardial injury. And the third mechanism by which it can cause cardiac injury is due to the systemic manifestations. As we know, it is a multi-system disease. The systemic manifestations of COVID, like sepsis and DIC, it can also cause myocardial injury. Now, how does it present to us? So, there are various ways in which the COVID-19 can affect the heart. One, in which it can present with myocardial injury. It can present with cardiac arrhythmias. It can present with venous thromboembolism. It can also present with heart failure, cardiogenic shock, and cardiac arrest. Now, coming to the elevation of cardiac biomarkers or myocardial injury. So, myocardial injury is quite common in COVID-19 infection, and the prevalence can range from about 7% to 28%. Now, how do you define a myocardial injury? The myocardial injury is defined as elevation of cardiac biomarkers. Here we take into account, most of the studies have taken into account high sensitivity cardiac troponin. So, elevation of high sensitivity cardiac troponin more than 99% of the upper limit of normal, along with or in addition to you have new onset of ECG or echo abnormalities will define myocardial injury. And this injury may not, the etiology may vary. You can have either ischemic, the injury may be mediated by ischemia, or it can be a non-ischemic mechanism. And this elevation of the high sensitivity, the levels of high sensitivity cardiac troponin correlates with disease severity as well as mortality. And not only its absolute level, the dynamic increase in troponin is also associated with a higher mortality rate. It is found that patients who have non-survivors, they have a higher level of high sensitivity cardiac troponin, and this level progressively increased till death. Whereas in people who survived, though they had an elevated troponin, the subsequent evaluation did not show a dynamic increase in troponin. So this may suggest that we should do a monitoring of cardiac troponin levels every few days. So it is an important prognostic marker also. Now, coming to the etiology of myocardial injury, what causes this elevation of cardiac biomarkers? It is very difficult to differentiate. So, the proposed mechanisms are one, it could be a ischemic myocardial injury. So, this systemic inflammatory response increases the risk of plaque rupture and thrombus formation, and this can result in what is known as a type 1 MI. But this is uncommon in COVID-19 infection. The commonest cause for an ischemic myocardial injury is a type 2 MI. So type 2 MI is because a viral infection, it causes hypoxemia, it causes vasoconstriction, because of which the myocardial oxygen supply is reduced. At the same time, the sepsis, the hemodynamic effects of sepsis will lead on to an increased myocardial oxygen demand. So this in turn results in a chronic myocardial or a sustained supply-demand mismatch, leading on to myocardial ischemia and myocardial injury, especially so in patients who have an underlying cardiac disease. The third mechanism is a DIC. So DIC can cause thrombosis, that is vascular thrombosis, especially in the epicardial vessels and also in the microvasculature, resulting in myocardial dysfunction. So all said and done, the diagnosis of an acute MI should always be based on clinical judgment, symptoms and signs, ECG changes and imaging study. Just because there is an elevated troponin level or there's a rise or fall in troponin levels does not make a diagnosis of acute MI. It should be clinical judgment based utilizing the symptoms, ECG changes as well as imaging studies if required. So this is, as I said, there are some features in echo that favor a condition other than acute coronary syndrome, because you can also have stress cardiomyopathy, myocarditis, or even have non-cardiac causes of chest pain. So echo features which favor a diagnosis other than acute coronary syndrome include no wall motion abnormalities during chest pain. If you do not have a regional wall motion abnormality which is not localized to a particular coronary artery territory, that is wall motion abnormalities in a non-coronary distribution, or if you have non-specific findings like a small pericardial effusion. Then, as I mentioned, the myocardial injury, it could be non-ischemic. It may not be related to myocardial ischemia. May not be related to myocardial ischemia. This includes they can have myocarditis, they can have stress-induced cardiomyopathy, or it can have a cytokine release syndrome. So myocarditis and stress-induced cardiomyopathy is difficult to differentiate unless you have a cardiac MRI, which is most of the times not possible to be done in this setup. And to be noted is this cardiomyopathy can develop even in patients with mild or absent respiratory symptoms, and sometimes even a reverse Takotsubo cardiomyopathy has been described in patients with COVID-19 infection. Now coming to acute heart failure, myocarditis and acute heart failure, the exact incidence or prevalence is difficult to, it's not published, but in studies which have shown that in about non-survivors, that is in about a study in Wuhan which conducted on about 700 and odd patients, they found that patients who were non-survivors, they had almost 49% heart failure, whereas patients who survived the infection, it was only about 3%. And in this subgroup of patients, the baseline risk of heart failure was only about 1%. Similarly, in another study, it was shown that it is about 53% in non-survivors and is about 12% in survivors. So now what causes this acute heart failure? It could be due to de novo myocardial injury, or it could be the viral infection causing a decompensation in patients who are already having a known or a undiagnosed cardiac illness. Now coming to myocardial injury with cytokine release syndrome. So here what happens is, and there is a, as I mentioned, there is a hyperinduction. All pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, TNF alpha, there is hyperinduction of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And this cytokine storm, this term is used. This in an acute phase, it causes activation of the neural sphingomyelinase pathway, and subacutely it causes a nitric oxide mediated blunting of the beta adrenergic signaling. This in turn results in a depressed myocardial function. Now, what about arrhythmias and conduction system disease? So it could be a first presentation. So in a case series, it was shown that about 7% of the patients, palpitation was the presenting symptom. And a new onset arrhythmia or an arrhythmia which is rapidly progressive could indicate a cardiac involvement. If you look at all the ECG manifestations, obviously sinus tachycardia would have been the commonest ECG presentation, but arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, atrial arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter can occur. And even ventricular arrhythmias like ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation is common. And to note is that there's a higher incidence of malignant arrhythmias in patients who have elevated troponin and also in patients or admitted who needs an ICU care, indicating severe myocardial injury. So it's important that all patients who are admitted should have a baseline ECG to document the baseline QRST morphology, and very important, the QT interval also. Venous thromboembolism. So are COVID-19 patients predisposed to increased risk of venous thromboembolism? Yes, because many of them may be immobilized. There is chronic inflammation and there is the hypercoagulable state. All this increases the risk of venous thromboembolism. And in fact, there is a term used as thromboinflammation or COVID-19 associated coagulopathy is a term that is used for this hypercoagulable state and the predisposition to venous thromboembolism in COVID-19 patients. Patients can have DVT, pulmonary embolism, and the incidence of DVT can range from 1.1% in patients who are hospitalized but not in the ICU to about 69% in ICU patients if you do a Doppler ultrasound screening. And the D-dimer levels and the FDP titers correlates with severity of the venous thromboembolism risk. Okay, and it is very important that any patient who is relatively asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic who has a sudden clinical worsening, you have to always consider the thromboembolism either in the coronary or in the lung or in the other peripheries. Anticoagulant therapy, as sir has already mentioned, is it necessary to give prophylactic anticoagulation? Yes, all hospitalized patients needs prophylactic anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin preferred over unfractionated heparin. In a setting of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, you can use fondaparinux. If anticoagulants are contraindicated or unavailable, you can use mechanical thromboprophylaxis, but both should not be combined together. And of note is there is interaction between some antiviral treatment and direct oral anticoagulants. Now, is it necessary to give empirical therapeutic agency anticoagulation in critically ill COVID-19 patients? As I mentioned, that microthrombi is considered as one of the mechanisms of hypoxic respiratory failure in a subgroup of patients with COVID-19. But as of now, there is no evidence to use empirical therapeutic intensity anticoagulation in critically ill COVID-19 patients. trials are going on using different doses of heparin, and results are awaited. And not only in the venous system, even arterial thrombosis is common in patients with COVID-19. So those patients who have recurrent clotting of access devices or extracorporeal circuits, you can increase the intensity of anticoagulation to an intermediate intensity. And the third question is, should these patients, since they are at risk of venous thromboembolism, should these patients receive post-discharge thromboprophylaxis? So in acutely ill patients who have acute medical illness, it has been found that the risk of venous thromboembolism can exist even up to 90 days post-discharge. And whether this risk in COVID-19 patients, this risk is high enough to recommend post-discharge thromboprophylaxis, we're not very clear. And the decision to use should be considered taking into account the risk factors of venous thromboembolism at the time of discharge. For example, some of the patients may be discharged earlier because of want of beds. Second is whether there is a reduced mobility, bleeding risk, as well as the feasibility. So as of now, post-discharge venous thromboembolism prophylaxis is not recommended, but FDA has approved 2 regimens. This is basically on a trial basis. One is giving rivaroxaban 10 milligram daily for about 31 to 39 days, because most of the times they say it's up to 48 days, the risk is the highest. Or another oral anticoagulant, that is betrixaban, which can be given. This is also, the regimen is given for about 42 days. These are the inclusion criteria for those patients who have been recruited into these trials. That is specific patients, not all patients. All patients post-discharge extended thromboprophylaxis is not given. So these are the few criteria for enrolling the patients and giving them extended thromboprophylaxis. Now we know that what are the special considerations in COVID-19 patients requiring therapeutic anticoagulation. Whereas, for example, there may be patients who are having atrial fibrillation, or there may be patients who are already on therapeutic anticoagulation. So these patients, if they develop COVID-19, so what are the special considerations you should look at? One, if you're using dexamethasone, it's an inducer of CYP3A4, and the extent of this interaction with direct anticoagulants is known. The 2 drugs, that is IL-6 immunomodulated like tocilizumab, can increase the cytochrome P450 activity, should not be used together with apixaban or rivaroxaban. Plus, you also be careful when you're using warfarin along with that. And antiviral drugs can increase the concentration of direct oral anticoagulants and decrease active metabolite of clopidogrel and prasugrel. And word of caution for those people who are on regular warfarin users. There are some patients you cannot shift them over to direct anticoagulants, like patients who have mechanical valves, etc. So these patients who are regular warfarin users, who are unable to get INR monitoring during isolation, who are candidates who can like non-valvular AF, you can shift them to direct oral anticoagulant therapy. But in patients who cannot be shifted, like patients who have a mechanical valve, pregnant patients, everybody, those patients, maybe you can extend the duration of INR monitoring, but still they have to be continued on warfarin itself. So this is just to summarize the mechanisms, the possible mechanisms and the cardiovascular manifestations. As I said, it could be direct cardiotoxicity, it could be the hyperinflammatory state, could be because of supply-demand mismatch, the cytokine storm, or DIC. And various cardiovascular manifestations include acute coronary syndromes. It can have present with arrhythmias, venous thromboembolisms, myocarditis, etc., and heart failure and cardiogenic shock. Now, another important aspect, as the number of cases increase, we realize that there is an interaction of COVID-19 and the cardiovascular diseases. So, COVID-19 patients with cardiovascular disease have an increased risk of severe disease as well as death. And the fatality rate for comorbid patients is higher than the average population. For example, if a hypertensive is about 6%, for diabetes is about 7.3%, and for patients with cardiovascular disease is about 10.5%. And in different studies have shown that the mortality can range from as low as it can range from about 7% in patients who have who are troponin negative and no comorbidities, to about almost up to 69% who have elevated troponin and cardiac comorbidities. Now, coming to the second aspect of the talk. So, in this pandemic, what are the challenges we face in managing acute coronary syndrome patients in our setup? So, one most important thing is the patient dealing. So, as already we are seeing that the many countries have documented almost a 40 to 60% reduction in the ACS admissions during this COVID pandemic. So one of the reasons is that the patient delay. There may be a lack of transportation, especially in our setup. Probably the lack of routine medical services at the first medical contact, or most important, the patient's fear of contracting an infection from the healthcare system. The media has to address this, and it has to be made clear to the patients that the healthcare system is safe to be, they can access this healthcare system in a safe manner, and patients should not delay treatment and ultimately result in fatal complications. The second challenge which faces is that the availability, or rather the non-availability of a rapid nucleic acid test, which helps in differentiating the patient or discriminating the patient who are COVID positive or negative. And third is the number of centers. We have limited number of centers for testing for SARS-CoV, and most of the times the results are available only after 24 hours to 72 hours. So this is a challenge in a setting of acute coronary syndrome where reperfusion is time-bound. Now, coming to the reperfusion strategy for acute MI, this is the CSI guidelines which have been given. So at the onset, I would mention that all patients who come with the initial contact, you have to be screening them regarding their history of travel, the history of contact with COVID-19 patients, and respiratory symptoms. And the CSI, according to the CSI guidelines, you can divide the patients into three groups. The group A. Group A, these are the confirmed COVID-19 patients. Currently, we do not see this group of patients. We will not see many of them. But as the community transmission increases and as the testing becomes rampant, we are likely to see confirmed COVID-19 patients coming to who are presenting to us. Group B, this is a suspect COVID-19 patients whom we do not have a test result available and who may have history of contact. But in the current era of community transmission, probably most of the patients may belong to this group, wherein they may be asymptomatic, but still they may be carriers of COVID-19. Or they may be infected with COVID-19. And the third group is the patients who have confirmed non-COVID-19 patient, or they who have a low clinical probability of COVID-19. So currently it is mentioned that because of the non-availability of rapid testing, decisions regarding for all decisions, it's best to club group A and group B together. That is a confirmed positive and the suspected cases are grouped together, and that is how the guidelines are being made for addressing this. So if you have a confirmed or a suspected COVID-19 patient who presents within 12 hours, primary PCI is preferred, can be performed, and is preferred if the necessary precautions and preparedness are available. Like you can have an isolated catheterization laboratory and use minimum trained personnel for the procedure. Adequate and appropriate PPEs are available for all healthcare workers, and the respiratory status, as Sir mentioned, it's only mild or moderate. As we know, the benefit of primary PCI may not be much in a patient who have a severe respiratory infection. So it is mentioned that a prudent option may be thrombolysis. Is a prudent option as PCI may not be feasible due to the prevailing logistic problems. It to be done in a timely manner, especially if the patient is hemodynamically stable. So if a hemodynamically stable, if you are not prepared, or if you do not have the necessary facilities available, thrombolysis is always a prudent option. In a patient who is hemodynamically unstable, ACS patient who is hemodynamically unstable, still PCI is an ideal option, especially if the COVID-19 status is mild or moderate. However, if it is not feasible, thrombolysis should still be tried even if the patient is unstable, keeping in mind a plan for rescue PCI, by which time you may be able to get a COVID report. So group C patients, there is no confusion. You follow the pre-COVID-19 strategy. And NSTMI patients, stable NSTMI patients, CAG or PCI should be preferably deferred until a COVID-19 negative test result has been obtained. And also mention small towns, villages who are in a hub and spoke model, thrombolysis should be the preferred reperfusion strategy. Inter-institutional transfers should be discouraged as far as possible. Now, a few words on protection or the preparedness of the cardiovascular care team. First, paramount importance is protect yourself. Appropriate PP is important. Preferable to intubate patients who have a borderline respiratory status before wheeling in case a patient is hemodynamically unstable. Echocardiogram to be ordered for only if you are going to give an additional information. And minimal equipment should be used in the CCL during the PCI procedure. And most of the times, there's a cardiac cath lab. We'll need, since the cardiac cath lab needs cleaning after procedures on a patient with a suspect or confirmed, most of the times the turnaround time will be prolonged. And better to use procedures or approaches that limit the number of the exposure as well as the number of healthcare personnel involved. Now, coming to a few words on cardiac medications. Coming to the medical management is largely unchanged. There are some possible drug interactions are there. For example, amiodarone with hydroxychloroquine, wherein you need to monitor the QT interval, and also the drugs like antiviral drugs and its interaction with antiplatelets and anticoagulants we already mentioned. And word on statins. So statins, especially pitavastatin, has been shown to inhibit the SARS-CoV main protease. which is a key enzyme and is a potential drug target, and this has to be explored in further studies. And there has been reports that there's a lower incidence of COPD and influenza deaths in patients on moderate dose statins, but this is still a contentious report. So statins, as of now, should be used only as per the usual clinical indications. Now, there has been a key controversy as to whether the use of AC inhibitors and ARBs might be detrimental or beneficial in COVID-19. As Sir has already mentioned, ACE2, it is used by the COVID. It is for intracellular, for binding and intracellular entry. And this ACE2 basically cleaves angiotensin 2 into angiotensin 1 to 7, which is a vasodilator. And it is, this gene is present on the X chromosome. It has been found that ACE2 levels are higher in males, and this may be the reason why probably the incidence as well as the severity of COVID-19 is more in males. Just to show that it is angiotensin, ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which causes a lot of detrimental effects on the heart as well as also on the lungs. Whereas this ACE2, which converts angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1 to 7, which causes vasodilatation. You also have something known as a soluble ACE2, which is present in circulation, which also has a catalytic activity. And this soluble ACE2 can be used as a decoy receptor or a molecule for SARS-CoV. Okay, and what is the effect of angiotensin 2? So angiotensin 2 can cause vasculopathy and thrombosis. It can cause inflammation. It will also cause coagulopathy by increasing the tissue factor as well as the PAA1. And now the importance of ACE2 was appreciated when this enzyme was identified as a functional receptor, as already mentioned. And ACE2 knockout mouse has been shown to have severe lung injury caused by increased hydrostatic pressure. And SARS-CoV-2 decreases the surface expression of ACE2 during infection. So a decreased ACE2 activity can lead to increased angiotensin 2 and further downregulation of ACE2 in a vicious cycle, in driving acute lung injury. So ACE2 is the angiotensin 2 is directly associated with lung tissue damage, and ACE2 is inversely associated with lung tissue damage. So this can have this can have an impact on the therapeutic aspect also. So the question is whether ACE2 is upregulated by ACI and ARB, and does this facilitate the COVID-19 cell entry and increase the severity of infection? So despite the 61% sequence similarity, AC inhibitors do not affect the ACE2 receptors. And there has not been any good evidence of ACE2 upregulation associated with these drugs in human beings. It's only animal models where they studied using lisinopril and enalapril. They've shown that there is an upregulation of ACE2, and there is no good evidence in human beings. And the ACE2 enzyme itself is not inhibited by ACE, the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors or ARB. Therefore, to summarize, from a theoretical standpoint, AC inhibitors and ARBs might facilitate entry into the respiratory cells, leading to viral mediated cell damage. On the other hand, these same medications might actually upregulate ACE2 and decrease acute lung injury caused by the virus. So it is not clear which of these activities are predominant in individuals with COVID-19. In the meantime, all the current cardiology guidelines recommend that patients on AC inhibitors and ARBs should continue taking their medications as usual and should not continue them just because of this infection. So that is the bottom line. Now coming to the second aspect which is of importance, that is, since many of the drugs which are being used can cause QT prolongation, what's the current guideline? Like hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, azithromycin, even drugs like ritonavir and many of these antiviral drugs can cause QT prolongation. So most important, you obtain a baseline ECG and a baseline QTC should be obtained. And some QT intervals like a prepubertal QT interval less than 460, and the post-pubertal males less than 470 and females less than 480, the chances of tox is low. So after 2 to 3 doses, if you find that the corrected QT goes more than 500 milliseconds, or if there's a change in QT interval is more than 60 milliseconds, then you should know that there is a risk of tox is high. Stop additional QT prolonging drugs, correct electrolyte abnormalities, maintain the potassium around 5 milliequivalents. Ideally, patients should be put on continuous telemetry because you can't keep on taking ECGs and coming in close contact with the patient. And if the patient develops a tox, these drugs should be stopped. This is just a flow chart. You can just go through that. So, patients should be looked for underlying cardiac disease, and you should have look for evidence of cardiac injury or look for evidence of moderate cardiac symptoms. As I mentioned, the gist of it is that you should have a baseline QTC. After 2 to 3 doses, you measure the corrected QT. If it's going up more than 500 or if there's a change of more than 600, or if there is a widening of the QRS, or there is a newly developed bundle branch block, a high-grade AV block, or a deteriorated cardiac function, always consider an alternative. And if the patient develops Stausites, always it should be stopped. And another important aspect is, even a patient you have stopped, you're given chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, and you have stopped the medications, when you're going to give another medicine which can prolong QTC, it is to be noted that especially hydroxychloroquine and all, the half-life may be more about a week or so. So still the effect may be there and patients can develop prolonged QT. To summarize, the COVID-19 is a pandemic which continues to grow, and the severity and the mortality risk is more in patients with established cardiovascular disease. And in a patient who presents in what appears to be a typical cardiac syndrome, COVID-19 infection should be in a differential during the current pandemic, even in the absence of fever or cough. And the risk-benefit ratio of primary PCI versus lighting therapy as to both the patient as well as the hospital personnel will have to be assessed. And cardiac cath lab preparedness with adequate PPV is mandatory for care of COVID-19 patients. And most important, the protection of healthcare workers is paramount so that the workforce is not depleted and is available as the pandemic evolves. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for the exhaustive speech on the cardiovascular manifestations of COVID-19. We'll have the question answer session at the end. Now I call upon Dr. Arun Kumar Arsappa, Head of the Department of Cardiothoracic and Vascular Surgery, to share his knowledge on the cardiovascular aspects of perspectives of COVID-19 pandemic.
Good afternoon, one and all. I think my work has become very simple because of the previous two speakers who have done extensively and elaborative information about COVID-19, how the pathophysiology happens, how the disease progresses. I'm sorry, there are some technical issues. Okay, good afternoon, and I welcome all you to this webinar once again. So, my topic is made very easy because of my previous speakers, because they have, I think, extensively covered about the COVID-19 issues and the pathophysiology of how it happens and how it affects the lungs and heart, which is very vital organs and which is getting infected in most of the patients. And as most of you know, the misery of the COVID-19 pandemic is very bad. It's affecting almost all of the patients now because of the community transmission, and it's severely affecting the practice of people like us, the cardiothoracic surgeon and other surgeons as such. So I'd like to enumerate what happens to this COVID-19 pandemic to cardiac surgery and cardiothoracic surgeons in my way. So I'll be going through all this discussion in the following schema. So I'll generally discuss about certain aspects, go to discuss about what we do in the OPD department, and what happens in the perioperative period, what happens in the postoperative period, how do you follow these cardiac patients during this COVID period, and what could be the future. So COVID-19 and the cardiac patients, as already spoken of by my previous speaker, like the cardiac patients who are more vulnerable to COVID are people who have comorbid factors like diabetes mellitus, hypertension, and arrhythmias according to WHO. So in case of acute ACS, as already discussed, there is a chance of rupture of fatty plaques, which can lead to acute Turner syndrome and acute MI. The patient can also present without this as myocarditis or pericarditis. But even at present, we don't have any evidence to show that COVID affects valvular heart disease or cause any infective enteritis on existing bioprocesses or the mechanical processes. So again, people who have got heart transplanted with immunosuppression, and patients with concomitant leukemia and lymphoma and other cardiac conditions, elderly, frail people, and also pregnant women with cardiovascular diseases, and patient having heart failure, dilated cardiomyopathy, and congenital cyanoid heart diseases, and HOCM patients are very high risk of getting COVID infected. So these are the patients who are vulnerable for COVID-19 and cardiac conditions. So we have to take care of those patients. First, let me just go through a tour from outpatient department. So most of the time we directly come into contact with patients, and until proved otherwise, all patients whom we come to contact and no patients should be treated as COVID suspects or COVID positive. So we try as far as possible to minimize appointments for our routine checkups for all the cardiac patients. If we are going to do a routine checkup for all the operated patients or the pre-operative patients, we could try what is called as telemedicine or a telephonic conversation with all these patients if they are hemodynamically stable and not having a lot of symptoms. So if the patient need to be seen in our outpatient department, what we are supposed to do, you use the personal protective equipment, PPE, if feasible, most of the time, or at least a surgical gown should be worn with a fully covering head with cap and N95 mask with face shields covering the face during the consultation. And try to maintain a social distance of at least 2 meters between you and the patient. I can show you in this picture, like we have a patient here, and this is a consultant here. We maintain a distance of at least 2 meters between the patient and the consultant. And when you try to examine the patient, try to go behind the patient with all your gadgets as usually, and examine the heart as well as the lung. You not go in front of the patient and auscultate with the heart. So what the patient's responsibility is, the patient should cover the face with a mask covering the nose and mouth, and you have to use a disposable glove while examining the patient. Try to avoid air-conditioned rooms and try to examine the patient in a well-ventilated, well-lit room with windows kept open, and provide a hand-washing facility outside the OPD for the patient. Use hand sanitizer judiciously before and after examining the patient by the consultant, and all the table and seat which are used by the patient should be cleaned by 1% sodium hypochlorite solution, which is a guidelines given by ICMR recently. So now I come to main topic, which is how to triage the heart patients for surgery. Now, how do you triage the patient? I'm going to tell you in subsequent slides, but first we should know what is the severity of the disease happening, the severity of the cases happening outside. So as of now, about 28.4 million cases have been totally cancelled, taking 760 centers all over the world across the globe. And out of which 72.3% of all operations got cancelled were cancer surgery patients and cardiac surgery patients. So the cardiac surgery triage has to be done based on certain scores called medically necessary time-sensitive procedure according to JACS, January 2020. And this is what we keep in mind during pandemics. From the left extreme, you can see, is it okay to proceed to do surgery or reserve operation theatre and have a capacity for emergent or urgent cases, or procedure is not justified. So keep all this in mind and plan for surgery. Pandemic surgery guidance. Yes, in case of emerging surgery, what we do, planned surgery, what we do, and what we are supposed to do, or it's just a nutshell, we are trying to do that. In emergent surgery, sorry, you don't need to do COVID-19 testing, but you do the risk assessment as already told, based on the symptoms of the patient. Do a pneumonia assessment, like take an X-ray chest and CT chest, and treat every surgery as a potential risk for the patient as well as the staff. This is an emergent surgery. In planned surgery, you do the testing, COVID-19 testing if it's feasible, at least before 48 hours of surgery, and do the risk assessment as usual for any planned surgery. Postpone the surgery if at all it's possible due to this COVID reasons. And if you have a planned surgery, execute it accordingly as per your plan. In the operation room, you minimize the number of people who are there in the operation room. You use only required senior skilled staffs, and highly motivated and rehearsed team is better in operation room to minimize the infection. And as far as the anesthesia is considered, you can use an epidural or spinal or regional anesthesia as far as possible instead of using the general anesthesia, and try to minimize the use of positive pressure ventilation. So with this, I would like to classify the surgeries, cardiac surgeries, and how to triage these patients as 3 tiers, basically Tier 3, Tier 2, and Tier 1. Tier 3 is urgent surgery, and as all know, the cardiac surgery is basically classified or basically done in these 3 varieties called aortic disease, coronary disease, and valvular heart disease. In aortic disease, if it is an acute aortic dissection, particularly involving the proximal aorta, extending into the pericardium or into the myocardium or into the coronary arteries, which can cause mechanical problems like a cardiac tamponade, it needs urgent attention. So there is no necessity to defer the patient. Aortic aneurysms with symptoms, we again take the patient immediately. You cannot defer the patient. In coronary disease, whenever the patient has come with ACS and a failed PCI, as a rescue or bailout surgery, we are supposed to go and do surgery. Significant left main coronary artery disease with symptoms, that is more than 50 or 60% of the lesions, we are again go and do surgery. acute MI with mechanical complications like tamponade and VSR, yes, we had to go and do the surgery. And any other PCA complications, post-PCA complications, as a surgical bailout, you're supposed to go and do the surgery urgently. In valvular heart disease, in case of acute ischemic MR with the papillary muscle dysfunction, you go ahead and do the urgent surgery. In MR severe with refractory heart failure, in case of severe MS and AS with refractory heart failure, a severe AR with refractory heart failure, and when thrombosed left side prosthetic valves or infant endocarditis with surgical indication, these are all the indications where you're going to do urgent surgery, just Tier 3 indications. In Tier 2, what happens? We defer surgery for at least 4 to 12 weeks because we wait for this period whether a patient is having COVID symptoms or not. So most likely the valvular heart disease patients like severe MR with chronic heart failure, severe MS and AS with chronic heart failure and chronic angina, or severe AR with chronic heart failure. These are the patients who can wait for about 4 to 12 weeks. In Tier 1, we defer surgery at least for about more than 12 weeks. We wait for all the symptoms to get subsided even the patient is going to be COVID positive. So again, aortic disease, aortic aneurysms without symptoms, or any uncomplicated descending thoracic or aortic arch dissection, we can just wait for 12 weeks. Coronary artery disease with multivessel disease without any acute coronary syndrome, we can wait for more than 12 weeks. In valvular heart disease, severe asymptomatic aortic stenosis without heart failure, or any other asymptomatic valvular heart disease, we can definitely wait for more than 12 weeks. So this is just a tabular column to show how we triage the patients during the COVID period. And see, this is a Tier 3. You can see Tier 3 is high acuity cases where we proceed the surgery without any delay, and even without doing any COVID test. You can take precautions of PPEs and start doing the case. In Tier 2 or intermediate acuity cases, these are the patients where we can wait for 4 to 12 weeks, and based on the testing, like if there's a high pretest probability, which means if there's a high prevalence rate in your community, we do not order the test. We just go ahead and do the test with COVID-19 PPE precautions. If there's intermediate pretest probability, then we order the test for COVID. If the test is positive, we go ahead with the COVID-19 PPE and precautions. If it's going to be negative, we take the standard PPE and the precautions. And if there's a low pretest probability, we do not order the test and we take a standard PPE precautions. In Tier 1, I already told you, you can wait for more than 12 weeks. Again, the pretest probability, if it's going to be high, do not order for any test. Go ahead and do the surgery. If there's low pretest probability, again, do not order the test and go use standard PPE and do the surgery. Intermediate pretest probability, you order for the test. If it's positive, use standard PPE precautions and do surgery. And if it's negative, use the standard PPE and take the precautions. So the preoperative workup of cardiac surgery patients already been discussed by pulmonologists and cardiologists. We treat all the patients who come to us as COVID positive until proved otherwise. So RT-PCR is done 48 hours before surgery, and as already discussed, it's only 60% sensitive. We have 15 to 30% of false negative report. As you all know, it depends upon the technique of swab collection. So we add CT scan chest, which is complementary RT-PCR, and also already discussed blood investigations if the CV shows lymphopenia, raised LDH, ALT or AST, and if the patient is Tier 2 or Tier 1, try to postpone the surgery. So what is the perioperative conduct which has done in COVID-19 pandemic across the globe? What we usually do is, in most of the centers, we have a surgical review committee encompassing the surgeon, anesthesiologist, nursing and admin staffs. And what is their role? They sit and do their communication mostly through video conferencing. The objective of it is to triage the cases, limit the exposure to the patients and healthcare workers, and allocate resources judiciously. So this is what is very important during this COVID period, because the resources are very few, and if the disease is going to be more prevalent, we have to reserve these resources for treating the COVID patients rather than treating the cardiac patients who can wait for some time. So with regards to cleaning of the theatre, high cleaning of the entire operation theatre with the housekeeping staffs who are wearing PPE is mostly done ideally, or PPE provision for all the staffs involved in the healthcare, right from the surgeon to OT technicians, should be given, including the face mask, face shield, and eye goggles. As you can see, this is one of our theatre where we did emergency surgery for a left main coronary disease critically ill patient. You can see all the staff members are wearing PPE, including the OT technician. So ensure that all of them are wearing PPEs. And I think the AGP has already been discussed by my previous speaker. What is aerosol generating procedures? like intubation, extubation, tracheostomy, bronchoscopy, endoscopy, laparoscopy with use of gas, any cardiac or thoracic surgery, chest tube placements, any orthopedic procedure which includes shows more blood splashes, or extensive use of electrocautery in the form monopolar, are all AGB producing things. So what are general precautions to take in the operation theatre? Restrict the personnel inside the operating room. Use only the highly skilled or rehearsed operation team. Then operation trolley should be kept ready and covered before the patients are getting wheeled into the operation theatre. All the surgical anesthetic supply should be there in the theatre to reduce the traffic. Proper donning, this is very important. Proper donning and doffing should be ensured by the trained observer who is going to observe the people who are using this PP kits. During intubation, only the anesthesia team should be there in the theatre. Surgical team is allowed only after 18 to 20 minutes inside the theatre, because this is based on the fact that all the operation theatres are positive pressure theatres, and we have 15 air changes per hour for the virus to get settled as an aerosol. Electrocautery usage should be very minimal with the minimal power settings, and try to avoid charring and smoke, which generates more aerosol. So this is one of the slide which is very important, because doffing the PP is very important, because most of the nosocomial infection or COVID-19 infection happening to health workers in the surgical setup or the ICU setup is only because of the inappropriate or the wrong way of doing the doffing method. So the doffing method is depicted here. You can see it's named 1, 2, 3, 4. It's self-explanatory. So you are supposed to doff very carefully to ensure that you don't get infected, right? What happens if the patient is COVID positive or suspected COVID patient in the OT? So patient is preferably placed in AIRs called airborne infection isolation rooms, which are negative pressure rooms. So these patients are wheeled from there to the theatre, and directly the patient is wheeled directly to theatre, and you never allow the patient to stay in the corridors. And ideally, you should have a specially designated COVID theatres where these patients should be taken care of. And you need a multidisciplinary workflow. We are already rehearsed enough to take care of these patients, positive patients, right from the patient's room to the operation theatre and to the post-operative room. So now I just briefly discuss about the anesthesia recommendations as given by the American Society of Anesthesiologists guidelines. As I already told you, limit the well-experienced staffs to be in the operation theatre. Patient can be either intubated in the designated isolation rooms or in the OR, depending upon the anesthetist's choice. The arterial and central lines can be made in the operation room. And the anesthetists usually use a rapid sequence induction with the use of video laryngoscopy to increase the distance between the airway and the operator. HEPA filters are used in the ventilator circuits. And should a ventilator circuit be disconnected by the anesthetist, kindly inform the team, and preferably endotracheal tube is clamped to prevent the aerosol generation. And avoid positive pressure ventilation if at all possible, like the CPAP or BiPAP. This is because this became very evident during the previous SARS outbreak in Toronto General Hospital, Canada. The healthcare workers were exposed to aerosolization via nebulizers, CPAP, BiPAP, and high flow oxygen therapy. And this is the reason these recent guidelines has been given. And during the extubation, a minimal person should be inside the room, and extubation criteria should be clearly fulfilled, and the answer should have a low threshold for reintubating the patient. Transport of all the patients in and out the OR should be done as per the workflow designated already. Kindly avoid chaos inside the theatre or outside the theatre. And HEPA filter should be incorporated between the Y circuit of the breathing circuit and endotracheal tube. And what about the postoperative care of the cardiac surgery patients? All the healthcare workers to don PPE, even the postoperative period. Limit the number of personnel and traffic inside the ICU care where the patient is going to go after the cardiac surgery. Avoid positive pressure ventilation like CPAP or BiPAP as far as possible. The entire team should know the possible complications which can happen post-operative period, including reoperations and arrhythmias. And you should know the use of fluid, judicious use of fluid use, because it can trigger ARDS post-operatively. So lung protective ventilation, for example, the permissive hypercapnia, low tidal volume strategy like keeping low tidal volume about 4 to 8 ml per kg of ideal body weight, respirator of less than 35 breaths per minute, PIP of not more than 5 centimeters of water, the plateau inspiratory airway pressure of less than 30 centimeters of water, and use of anticoagulation as already suggested by my previous speakers. And not on ECMO and COVID-19 pandemic, yes, some will have a doubt, can we use ECMO as a rescue therapy for all ARDS patients? It's actually a controversial topic. Is used as a rescue therapy with conflicting results, and even in Wuhan, China province where the COVID started, people started using ECMO to refer patients, critically ill patient, and almost 60 to 70% of the patient died after using ECMO. So the ECMO rescue was done only for 30 to 40% of the patient. Used as a last ditch measure to salvage if the patient is severely ill. After a lot of trial of mechanical ventilation, you can refer these patients to ECMO centers, because ECMO is a resource consuming procedure. It involves a lot of gadgets in the form of oxygenators, tubings, and also trained personnel to take care of this patient around the clock. So use as only last resort, as I already told you, in severely ill patient on prolonged ventilation support. We use what is called a veno-venous ECMO. We have two ECMOs, we have veno-venous ECMO and veno-arterial ECMO, or combined veno-venous and veno-arterial ECMO, but we usually use a veno-venous ECMO in this type of settings. And there's something called Extracorporeal Life Support Organization, which given some guidelines for ECMO referral. So what are the guidelines or rather indications for ECMO? When a patient has severe hypoxic respiratory failure, despite optimal ventilation strategies already enumerated, with severe hypercapnia, pH of less than 7.2 and PSCO of more than 80 millimeters of mercury for more than 6 hours, patient who have prolonged ventilation for less than 7 days, patient cardiogenic shock, which is refractory to your treatment of inotropes, vasoactive agents, and people with acute lung injury of Miller score of more than 3, and if the patient has single organ failure with no or minimal comorbidities, or patients who can be sent to these echo centers. What are the contraindications for ECMO? Any patient with disseminated malignancies, severe brain injury, current intracerebral bleeding, patient with multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, immunocompromised status patients, and any advanced age patients, which is only a relative contraindication, or any patient who had got a prolonged CPR of more than 1 hour before ECMO, are all contraindications for using ECMO during COVID setting. So in operation room and post-op disinfections, the current guidelines for disinfecting this is given by the government, and it is actually 1% sodium hypochlorite or 5% Lysol as per the ICMR guidelines. You can use adequate cleaning and sterilization of all the instruments to be done, and it will be done by a senior most person who is involved in doing sterilization of the instruments. Proper disinfection of the HEPA filters and the ventilation system should be done regularly in consultation with the anesthesiologist, head of the department, and the microbiology head of the department. Surgeries are usually planned at 3-day interval. So you do the day 1 surgery, at least you wait for another 3 days for doing the next surgery. That is on the 4th day, because the virus can stay active on surfaces, metallic surfaces, and plastic surfaces for at least 72 hours. Now there is a question: what happens if the post-operative patient becomes COVID positive? What to do? If they show some symptoms, what to do? Immediately inform the health authorities, shift them to designated COVID rooms or facilities, that is ICU facilities. And what happens to the team? Self-quarantine the whole team and close the operation theatre for appropriate time as directed by the health authorities. So what's the average time from the time of surgery to develop symptoms? It is approximately 2 days, and it usually takes about 10 to 12 days for these kind of patients to go for ARDS, if at all they happen. Okay, what we do for follow-up of the already operated cardiac patients. If the patient is physically well, we can follow up the patient after 10 to 14 days. If their hemodynamic is stable, then further follow-up can be made through teleconference or telephone if needed. But if the patient gets any warning signs at home, what are the warning signs? Patient gets a serious discharge in their wound, patient has bleeding episodes or any arrhythmias, palpitations, dyspnea, patients brought immediately to the hospital and immediate attention is given. So a patient can be seen by the general practitioner for any mild illness. For example, patient has a fever or headache, patient can go for the general practitioner's support. And this GPs can form they can liaise between the super specialty consultant and the patient per se to prevent a frequent contact between the patient and the super specialists. So the future of COVID-19 and its impact in cardiac surgery is very bad because regular updates are needed. We don't know for the emerging COVID-19 strains and emerging lot of thoughts happening in the COVID-19 pandemic. We still need to update every day. So what we think is the prevalence of the disease. So when the prevalence of disease usually dictates the strategy we use during the pandemics, during any pandemics. So when the prevalence of disease is going to be more, we have to have more caution and judicious use of resources to do all regular cardiac surgeries and reserve these resources only to do the major or urgent cardiac surgeries. So triaging will continue for another couple of years, and PPE is here to stay for some time. Training and retraining of all our staffs will going to take place now and then because of the recent updates to keep ourselves abreast about the recent trends and developments happening. what about the financial burden? This is the most important thing. It's going to be definite, both for the private and public sector, in terms of procuring items, procuring the resources, as well as paying salaries to the staff and all healthcare workers. So I think I given a bird's eye view about what happens in cardiac surgery, what happens, how to triage the patients, how to use the resources judiciously. So I thank you on and all for your patient listening. So last but not least, this slide shows all the martyrs or the COVID workers lost their precious life in treating the COVID positive patients, and they lost their precious life. Thank you on and all. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir, for your speech on the cardiovascular perspectives of COVID-19. Now the floor is open for questions.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Nagaraj is speaking.
Yes, sir. You can ask your question, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Now the community spread started or not?
Sir, ideally, sir, community spread, if you want to tell that, they need to assess the samples, sampling strategy has to be increased, sir. And already we are getting a lot of cases just because that we are not doing tests, sir. So we can't tell that whether really, because I already told you most of the cases are pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic. That also contributes at least some 30 to 40% of cases. So I think it's too early to comment on that. So if you want to assess this spread, whether community spread already done or not, they need to assess with the antibody testing, sir. I think antibody testing, I already told you, that is mainly for epidemiological purpose, whether these people got exposed to COVID-19 or not. Sir, there are some areas where rampant cases are there, because Maharashtra and there are some states openly they told that already community transmission has already occurred. But till now, in our Tamil Nadu and other states, they have not accepted that. But still, cases are there. I think many other cases they don't get the contact history. If there is no contact history, definitely. And this contact history and all, so there is no role to ask contact history when community transmission started. So it's a big worry. I think since cases are increasing, so I think that we have to consider. Not in Pondicherry, at least in major cities. At least, for example, in Mumbai, in Corporation of Mumbai, they openly announced in some areas community transmission is there. Okay, Chennai they are not accepted till now because they told that contact history is there. So until we are sampling all the patients, we can't come to a conclusion, sir.
Another question, sir.
Yes, sir.
Patients coming with 2 or 3 days fever.
Yes, sir.
But we are having the cough with expectoration, everything. We are having the doubt whether the patient is having corona or not. We are taking CT scan. If there is infiltration, can we take it as a positive before the result is coming?
Sir, actually, the role of CT scan, actually, based on the radiologist guidance, even on our guidelines, what we are telling is that CT is a somewhat cumbersome test, sir. You have to shift the patient to CT room. It involves a lot of people, a lot of healthcare workers and this thing and all. And CT room and machine has to be, sanitized after that. So CT should not be, used as a screening procedure. And moreover, radiological findings, whatever we told, the peripheral consolidation, the pattern and all, it is not only in COVID pneumonia. There are certain viral pneumonias also will present the similar picture, sir. So until we confirm that with this one, throat swab or nasopharyngeal swab or hybrid swabs with RT-PCR, we can't come to a conclusion this is definitely because of COVID-19.
Okay.
Sir,
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Yogesh, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, one issue is like patient comes to an emergency surgery.
Okay, sir.
Because 2 days back we had a patient with an presentation like intestinal obstruction.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Saturation of 90%.
Okay, sir.
Fever for history for 2 days.
Okay, sir.
And patient had throat pain also, but the patient had an intestinal obstruction.
Okay.
What
sir.
is the protocol, sir? Should we take a CT in this patient or not, sir?
Sir, actually speaking, this is the thing, sir. Sir, this patient actually having hypoxemia. You are receiving the patient with intestinal obstruction. The patient needs emergency surgery. Until proven otherwise, in this season, any patient with hypoxemia with unknown cause, without any underlying cardiac disease,
Because we cannot wait for a COVID result in this patient. We cannot
sir.
RT-PCR. It will take 48 hours.
you think that patient has a COVID case only. You should have all necessary precautions. If you want to save the patient, if you want to have the protocol, you use all the protocols. You consider that is a COVID-19 patient. Use all necessary precautions. Have a separate thing, necessary precaution. You proper PPE and all, doffing, donning, and all these things you should do, sir. Because you are telling typical history. Hypoxemia is there. Unexplained hypoxemia in this season with history of fever, sore throat. All these things are there. Definitely, COVID testing has to be done. If antigen test is there, sir, like now I already told you, antigen test it can give results immediately, but it has not been developed till now properly, and it has not been validated. All these RT-PCR and all take 6 hours, and because of load, they are giving results on next day only, and they are not accepting also. So in this case, instead of waiting for the report, you can go ahead thinking that this patient is definitely COVID. Have a personal protection. It's in your hands, sir, whether you to take or not. Yes, sir.
So one more. Can I have one more question,
Yes, sir.
sir?
Yes, sir.
What is the trigger for remdesivir and tocilizumab, sir?
Okay, sir. Sir, remdesivir, tocilizumab, actually, these are, tocilizumab is considered as a half-label drug. Actually, tocilizumab has not been completely approved because of the variable or mixed results. It has to be reserved only those patients who are having higher inflammatory, stimulus or inflammatory markers. For example, before giving tocilizumab, you should have at least 2-3 features. The patient should have a moderate to severe form of pneumonia, recurring higher oxygen or recurring high forms of ventilation, or the patient, after putting on oxygen also, they require, oxygen, the SpO2 is not improving with high flow nasal cannula also. You need intubation for this patient. In that group of patients, as a rescue therapy, you can use tocilizumab. But before starting, you do CRP ferritin levels, which is one of the easily available tests that shows that the patient is having some amount of cytokine storm. If facility is available, tocilizumab you can use after doing interleukin 6 level. Why I am not telling interleukin 6? Because it is not commonly done in normal labs. At the same time, sir, interleukin 6 level doesn't guide you for therapy. Only thing is that at baseline you may have a 200 to 300 times elevation, but based on that you can't decide how many doses to be given. Only maybe 2 or 3 doses can be given. Dose is 8 mg per kg, sir, as equal to Cefixime, whatever you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Can I have a question for Arun Kumar, sir?
Sir, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Please, sir. Please go ahead, sir. Sir?
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm able to hear you, sir. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. How does ECMO helps in this patient, sir? COVID patients.
Sir, I told you, sir. See, it
Yes,
was
sir.
given as a last resort only for all this COVID. The COVID patient, if the patient is very severely ill, sir, if the patient is very severely ill,
Yes.
see, the COVID-19 damages the lung very badly in these kind of patients. So, we think that we can give some rest to this lung. So, ECMO takes over and behaves like a lung, sir.
That's what, sir. I listened to your the PowerPoint, sir. But the thing is, like, is it really helps in the COVID pandemic, sir?
That is what, sir. That is what, sir. It's a conflict.
Is it trials? What does it say, sir? That's what
Sir,
I
it is
want.
a conflicting area, sir. Like research is all still going on, sir.
Yes, sir.
And as far as the statistics I've seen, there's an organization called ESLO, Extracorporeal Life Support Organization. They so far registered only 1,341 cases of ECMO, sir, all over the world across. I'm talking about past 6 months. Out of which they have taken 741 patients for ECMO. The registration was 1,340. 741 was taken for ECMO, and the results was positive, or the rescue was only for about 10 to 12% of patients. So you can imagine 80 to 90% of the patients they don't come out. And the criteria that these patients are taking only in severely critically ill patients. So whether the ECMO is a problem or the severe illness of the lung is a problem, we don't know. So this is still going on. We have to wait for that, sir.
Okay, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister.
Sir, are these antiviral drugs safe in pregnancy?
That's a good question, sir. It's this remdesivir, all this antiviral, whatever I just told, favipiravir and all, it is not safe in pregnancy. You have to weigh the benefits and you have to give. It is not safe to be given in pregnancy. It is not approved for pregnancy. Even for remdesivir, favipiravir, whatever drugs under trial is not safe in pregnancy. You need to rule out that before giving it. Regarding prophylaxis, you want to?
Any other questions from our students and other faculty?
Sir, what is your experience with the low molecular heparin, sir, in these patients?
Sir, that's what, sir. Sir, low molecular heparin has to be given for all the patients, hospitalized patients who require at least some point of care, except for asymptomatic and mild cases. All the patients got admitted in the hospital who require oxygen. Definitely, low molecular heparin, at least prophylactic once daily dose has to be given. That has to be given, sir. Mandatory. Because, sudden deaths and reported in some other COVID-19 patients. Patients are doing good, suddenly become hypoxemic, and then they are collapsing, succumbing. This hypoxemia, we don't know. That's really because of lung disease, or we don't know because of VQ mismatch secondary to pulmonary embolism. We don't know that. Even cardiac also. So that's why it's better, sir, to use at least once daily dose of low molecular heparin. Twice daily dose, I think cardiologist has to decide. We'll ask to cardiologist, twice daily dose.
As of now, therapeutic intensity anticoagulation is not recommended even in severely ill COVID patients because studies are still going on. And only thing, if, as I mentioned, if they have a clotting of arterial devices, arterial catheters or extracorporeal devices like ECMO and all those things, those patients you can always hike up and even probably give therapeutic intensity provided the bleeding risk is not very high. So it has to be used with caution only.
Sir, one question, cardiothoracic surgeons. To sir, lung transplantation in post-COVID lung. Actually, we know that it is too early to comment on this. Just your review on that, whether it is useful, is it really needed? You might have read the reports. Yes.
I think you already answered your question, sir. You asked the question, you answered the question. See, it is a very preliminary level. So, like, very few centers have attempted transplant, even during this COVID period. And when the lungs are totally destroyed bilaterally, people have attempted and succeeded in certain centers in the United States of America. I think about very hardly 1 or 2 cases of successful transplant. But we have to wait for a long time, sir, before we can make this as one of the treatment strategy for COVID-19 issues. So we're just waiting for what is going to happen. And once the guidelines are given properly, I think we can go ahead and do that. That's a recent update.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
But I think 2 patients, they attempted lung transplant in France. Both the patients died, I think, actually.
Yes, sir.
That was the case report, sir.
Yes, sir. It's an attempt, sir. Actually,
Yes, sir.
that was the last attempt to do something for this patient. So they attempted to transplant and see.
Yes, sir, they have done. They have tried that, but
Yes.
It was not
It
successful.
was not successful. Yes, sir.
Sir, what is the role of dexamethasone in treatment of COVID?
Sir, that's what, sir. Based on the, steroids have definitely have a role, sir. It's a potent anti-inflammatory agent. When you consider that there is an ongoing potential inflammation in the lungs or any other organs, we can definitely opt steroids. There are 2 options. We can give methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. Why dexamethasone? We are preferring because of recovery trial. Because in recovery trial that was recently done in UK, they studied all the drugs which are used for COVID-19. They found that those patients who received dexamethasone, at least 6 mg once daily, particularly the patients who are very sick, requiring oxygen, those patients who are on ventilator, these patients recover very fast, and the incidence of mortality is very low in this group of patients. So they came to a conclusion that dexamethasone should be offered 0.1 to 0.2 milligram per kilogram for the patients who are in moderate category, having a saturated less than 94, and then 0.2 to 0.4 milligram per kilogram has to be given for those patients severe category who are in ARDS, recovering mechanical ventilation, has to be given.
Not earlier, only
Yes,
late
sir.
case.
Yes, sir.
Late severe case. Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, but there are 2 centers in our state, like Pondicherry,
Yes, sir.
IGMC and JIPMER.
Yes, sir.
In IGMC, they are giving methylprednisolone for all the patients.
Yes, sir. Actually, that's what,
But they are giving dexamethasone for all the patients, but
Then
they both the things they say that there is no difference in outcome actually.
Sir, actually, there is two things. As a pulmonologist, if you ask me which is the best steroids, because methylprednisolone, target concentration of this drug in the lungs is very high. Usually, after you give methylprednisolone, either by IV or oral route, when you see target concentration in lung, it is very high for methylprednisolone. Dexamethasone is one of the oldest steroids we have used for many diseases. And one problem with dexamethasone, what we see is that prolonged hypothalamo-pituitary axis suppression, sir. Once you give dose, 1 or 2 dose only, you have a suppression. Sometimes this may also affect your tapering dose. But in recovery trial, they found that they used dexamethasone only. They found that this is much helpful. So it's better that you should stick for the you should stick to that dexamethasone only, because they are given for a lot of patients and they have a good experience. They found that it is very useful. There is not much of difference. You can use methylprednisolone or you can use dexamethasone, sir. But in IGMC also they changed, sir. Methylprednisolone was advised before this recovery trial, so they are following that. Nowadays they are changing to dexamethasone. Even in JIPMER also, sir.
Okay, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
If there are no further questions, I thank all the speakers who have come in spite of their busy schedule and for this webinar. I also thank the management for giving us the opportunity to conduct this webinar in our center. I thank all the senior faculties, postgraduate students who have attended this webinar. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.